first want to talk about the bill that you rolled out today with a catalog of issues that you could regulate in social media. Why start with this one?
Well, last fall I laid out a white paper that had 20 different ideas. Some good, some maybe not so good. And I'm going to have a series of legislative proposals. This is one of the first ones. This one's a little more technical than some of the later proposals, which will be around privacy or around identity validation, transparency, other areas that need exploration. But this one takes a look at the abuse, particularly for large platform companies, people with more than 100 million users, where you see manipulative tactics on their site or their application. I think we've all seen sites that have flashing arrows to say, press I agree, press I submit, but you could never find the unsubscribe button on the same site. This would set up an industry advisory group, similar to the model in the securities industry of FINRA. So that would set up rules and regulations that would be able to enforce this effort against what we call dark patterns, against manipulative behavior, particularly gearing as well towards children. Okay. And we think it's a good first step.
So if it's a first step, what are the odds that this becomes law, or does this have to get rolled into a bigger package that's maybe years down the road?
I think there's such interest from the public, from industry, and you're increasingly hearing, Mark Zuckerberg put an editorial in the paper a week ago calling for more regulation. I think the platform companies are now going to have an opportunity to put their money where their mouth is to see whether they support this legislation and other approaches. My thought is there may be a privacy vehicle that may move, because the platform companies have said they want national privacy regulations. And my hope is that if the privacy vehicle comes out of the Commerce Committee, this legislation and other legislative ideas that I'll be submitting may be able to be rolled into this.
You mentioned the Mark Zuckerberg op-ed in the Washington Post. There has been some concern that the companies themselves would be calling the shots or informing how lawmakers are actually regulating these companies. If these are best practices, why aren't these companies already doing this?
Well, because I think what we've seen in the days of an unregulated internet, in the days of a wild, wild west, the ability for these companies to self-police, they just don't have the right economic incentives aligned.
Even in the last year with the threat of regulation?
And we see they have gotten better in certain areas, but still, when there was hearings today, for example, for Google and Facebook about the volume of hate speech that appears on the internet, where we see both domestically and international forces trying to come and split apart democracy. So I think we are going to need rules of the road in this more technical area where we've tried to defer manipulative practices. We've started saying, let's see if we can create an industry-driven standards body. Again, the analogy for folks in the security field is FINRA, that could set these standards and then enforce these standards, but we'd have the Federal Trade Commission being the backstop if this self-regulation or this industry regulation wouldn't work.
Senator Warner, I'm glad you mentioned industry standard like FINRA, but I was actually thinking more like the FDA and the warning labels on cigarettes. I mean, could you see legislation going so far as to federally standardize the opt-in box so that users will know exactly what they're opting in for in terms of sharing their information with a platform? Or could there be, for instance, warning labels on platforms, on social media platforms, that warn that the product that a child is about to use could potentially be addictive?
I think all of these things are very much in the realm of the possible. And what we wanted to try to start with was to see if the industry standard setting body, because you need this body to be agile. You need it to be able to move with technology. We think this would be the first cut approach. And I think, again, we've seen, being a former business guy for longer than I've been a politician, FINRA does a fairly good job around some of the securities issues. We like to try that model first, but I do think you'll end up with some level of standardization, because what we have right now is, candidly, a whole series of tools that have been intellectually and scientifically proven to be extraordinarily manipulative. So trying to make sure people are a little more informed about what they're signing up for, trying to make sure people don't allow beyond first-party consent to some of these platforms, trying to make sure that if you're YouTube, you've got some standards in terms of the kind of videos that are being exposed to children, all are in this bucket.
Senator Warner, it's interesting, too, with this bill. This was not my top of mind issue in terms of the problem with social media and these websites, which is not to say that it's not one, and maybe it's an easier one to tackle. Today, we had kind of something that really shows how much of a problem there is with a lot of these new platforms. In the very hearing that the House Judiciary Committee was having about hate crimes and the rise of white nationalism, the YouTube stream carrying it had to be shut down, the comments anyway, because they were full of racism and offensive language. So, standards are important, of course, especially for this area that you're tackling. But how do we come up with standards that can address that sort of issue? A lot of these platforms are successful for the very reasons that they're very flawed.
Well, I think there's really, as we move into hate speech and content, there are really two different ways to look at this. All of these platform companies got granted an exemption back in the 90s at the kind of birthing of the internet and the birthing of these platforms, where they had no requirements to have any kind of control over their content.
Right.
When 2/3 of Americans get their news from Facebook and Google, maybe they ought to have the same requirements of CNBC in terms of some editorial control.
Can you imagine, though, what that would mean for these platforms?
That is called the Section 2. That is the Section 230, and I'm not saying I even want to go there, but that ought to be part of the debate. But there are a whole series of things short of that. For example, if somebody says they're Mark Warner and they're posting a message from Alexandria, Virginia, but that post is actually originating in St. Petersburg, Russia, maybe we ought to have that knowledge. Maybe we ought to have the knowledge to be able to know when we're being communicated. For example, with the Google live stream this morning, how many of those contents were actually generated by human beings? How many of them were generated by bots? And maybe we even ought to go, short of the full content, editorial content. Maybe there ought to be, and this would be a very challenging issue, maybe there ought to be questions around identity validation, particularly around hate speech. If you actually had to put your real name next to that, I think you might have some people backing off. But this is the kind of fulsome debate we ought to have. The good news is I don't think there's any Democrat or Republican position on this. This is really a question of these platforms are not going away. It's future past. And how do we maintain innovation but still give some level of protection to folks who are receiving this information?
Senator, if the price, though, to pay for regulating this industry in the way that you want to regulate it is stifling the tech industry, stifling a new generation of Facebooks and Googles from coming up, is it worth that price? And I ask this because there is some thinking that it is the deep-pocketed, large-cap, publicly traded social media platforms that are already out there that can afford to enforce any regulation that is put upon them. And it is the crop of younger, perhaps unformed tech companies still to come that won't be able to become the next Googles out there.
I think there's some validity in what you say. As a former tech venture capitalist, if I was in the apps business right now, your only exit is to a big company like Facebook or Google. So a whole other area that I'm looking at in terms of some rules would be more transparency. I think a lot of people feel like these platforms are free. There's nothing free about them. If we knew how many information points Facebook or Google has about us, I think that would be really relevant to us as consumers. If we knew how much your data was worth on a monthly basis to Facebook or my data was worth on a monthly basis to Google, that transparency might allow new entrants into the market, in effect, to disintermediate between the platform company and the consumer. So I want to try a pro-competition approach. I want to try an approach that tries to get rid of some of the manipulation. I do think we're going to need to get into the identity/content discussion. And obviously, we haven't even touched on privacy. So how do we set some rules of the road that will continue to foster innovation, but not allow the kind of abuse that takes place? And it's going to, the notion that this is the status quo is going to continue, though, just isn't going to be the case. You're going to see individual states act. You've already seen the Europeans act on privacy. You're starting to see the Brits now start to act on some of the content rules around hate. So this is coming, and my argument to these companies is work with us, let us get this right so that we can maintain American innovation. And frankly, I'd much rather have our government be setting the rules of the road than other countries.
One problem you haven't identified is antitrust, but some of your colleagues have raised that as an issue. Do you believe, after studying the likes of Facebook and Google for over a year on the Senate Intelligence Committee, these companies are too big to fail and they're too big to police themselves?
These companies have enormous power, and we do need to introduce more competition.
Does that mean breaking them up?
Here's my concern. These are now companies that don't exist in an American-only vacuum. These are all global companies, and I have some concern, as somebody who's very concerned about the rise of China, that if we were to kind of chop off the legs of Facebook and Google, that they might be replaced by Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, companies that are totally enmeshed with the Chinese government in their global economic plan. So are there ways, before I would get at least to the full breakup proposition, I would say, are there other rules of the road where we can introduce more competition through transparency, where we can try to prohibit some of this manipulative behavior in the rules I'm laying out, or the legislation I'm laying out today? Can we add some more privacy issues? And can we also look at this question around identity/content, particularly in the areas around hate speech?